Saipan, July 1944. The air is thick with humidity and the scent of smoke. In the aftermath of battle, the once green hills are littered with debris, helmets, rifles, and the broken silence of defeat. Under the blistering Pacific sun, a line of Japanese prisoners of war moves slowly toward a makeshift compound guarded by U.S. Marines. Their faces are blank, eyes downcast. To them, surrender is worse than death. They were raised to believe that capture was dishonor, that the Americans would torture or execute them without hesitation. But instead of bullets, they are handed something they don't understand. Sheets of paper, envelopes, pencils. An American officer, calm but firm, gestures for them to sit. Through an interpreter, he explains, "You may write home." The prisoners look at each other in disbelief. Write home? To Japan? One man's hand trembles as he grips the pencil. He hasn't written to his family since he left Tokyo 3 years ago. Around him, others begin to write, slowly, cautiously, as if expecting a trick. The letters they write that day will cross oceans and borders, and quietly begin to unravel one of the greatest myths of the Japanese Empire. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had entered its most brutal phase. The Empire of Japan, once unstoppable, was beginning to crumble under the relentless weight of Allied offensives. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, from New Guinea to Saipan, the U.S. military had clawed its way across the Pacific, one bloody island at a time. But with every American advance came a haunting pattern. Few Japanese soldiers ever surrendered. For the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was not an option. Their entire military ethos was shaped by the Bushido Code, the ancient samurai principle that placed honor above life. To die for the emperor was the ultimate virtue. To live as a captive was an unforgivable disgrace. From the moment they enlisted, soldiers were told that the enemy, especially the Americans, were barbaric, devoid of mercy, and intent on torturing prisoners. Propaganda posters in Tokyo depicted Allied troops as monsters, savages who mutilated captives for sport. This conditioning ran deep. On islands like Saipan, thousands of Japanese civilians, men, women, and even children, jumped off cliffs to their deaths rather than face capture. Surrender was not just forbidden, it was unthinkable. And yet, as the war dragged on, reality began to contradict the myth. When the first Japanese soldiers were captured alive in early battles like Guadalcanal in 1942, they braced for the worst. But what they found instead was unimaginable. The Americans fed them, bandaged their wounds, and even buried their dead with respect. Many POWs were too shocked to eat, convinced the food was poisoned. It wasn't. They were treated according to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States had ratified, though Japan had not. According to the convention, every prisoner of war was entitled to humane treatment, access to medical care, and the right to communicate with family through the International Red Cross. For the Japanese, who had been taught that mercy was weakness, this was a profound cultural shock. The Americans had another reason for this treatment, one both practical and psychological. They understood that propaganda could be fought not only with leaflets and broadcasts, but with behavior. If captured Japanese soldiers were treated well, it could weaken enemy morale, encourage surrender, and expose the lies of the imperial command. By 1944, as the fighting intensified in Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, more and more Japanese soldiers were taken alive, often wounded, starving, or shell-shocked. When they were brought to the American-run POW camps, their disbelief deepened. They were given food, medical attention, even cigarettes. But what truly stunned them came later, a right they never imagined they'd have in captivity: the ability to write letters home. In that small act, something shifted, not just for the prisoners, but for the course of psychological warfare in the Pacific. The simple act of writing became more powerful than any weapon. When the first Japanese prisoners began arriving in American custody, they were processed under the strict oversight of the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General's Office. In accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1929, each prisoner was photographed, registered, and assigned an identification number. From that point forward, their treatment was carefully recorded: food rations, medical visits, and even mail privileges. The International Committee of the Red Cross monitored every step, ensuring that no mistreatment occurred. For the U.S. military, this was not merely a gesture of compassion, it was policy. The United States wanted to set a moral and psychological standard that would distinguish it sharply from the Axis powers. In Europe, this meant treating captured Germans and Italians humanely. In the Pacific, however, the contrast was even more dramatic, because the Japanese military had gained a notorious reputation for its brutal treatment of Allied prisoners. At places like Bataan, Wake Island, and Burma, captured Americans and British soldiers had endured starvation, forced labor, and systematic torture. Thousands perished in the infamous Bataan Death March. American propaganda highlighted these atrocities, fueling public anger. Yet inside the military command, a quiet but deliberate decision was made. The U.S. would not mirror the enemy's cruelty. Instead, it would prove that civilization and discipline could be maintained even amid total war. Thus, when Japanese prisoners were captured in large numbers, especially after the battles of Saipan and Guam, they were sent to camps built specifically for their humane confinement. Some of these camps were established across the Pacific Islands, while others were located on the U.S. mainland, in states like Utah, Texas, and Hawaii. There, the prisoners worked under supervision, farming, constructing facilities, or helping with wartime labor shortages, all within the boundaries of international law. But what surprised the prisoners most wasn't the food, the clothing, or even the medical care. It was the opportunity to communicate with home. Through the Red Cross postal system, each Japanese prisoner was permitted to write a brief letter, often no more than 24 lines, censored and translated, but real nonetheless. The Americans provided stationery, pencils, and interpreters. The tone was to be factual and non-political. They could describe their health, their conditions, and their work. For men who had expected death, the chance to tell their families they were alive was a mercy beyond comprehension. Many Japanese POWs wept as they wrote. They began their letters with words like, "I am alive," "I am treated kindly," or "I eat every day." Such sentences were small acts of rebellion against years of indoctrination. They directly contradicted the imperial propaganda that claimed no Japanese soldier ever surrendered, that all who were captured were executed. The letters that made it through censors and reached Japan were rare, but they caused shock and confusion among families who had been told their loved ones had died honorably in battle. The Japanese War Ministry scrambled to suppress them. Officials labeled the writers liars and traitors, but the truth had already escaped through the mail, quiet, personal, and undeniable. What had begun as a small humanitarian policy now became a subtle weapon in the psychological battlefield of the Pacific. The Americans had found a way to break the myth of Japanese invincibility, not through bombs or bayonets, but through compassion and ink. Inside the barbed wire of the Saipan POW camp, the atmosphere was one of uneasy quiet. The prisoners were fed and housed, but their faces carried the same hollow expression, the look of men whose world had collapsed. These were not merely soldiers who had lost a battle. They had lost the very foundation of their identity. Raised from childhood to believe that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor, capture had stripped them of everything: dignity, family, and faith. But the Americans treated them differently than they expected. They were given food, clean clothes, even cigarettes. Medical corpsmen bandaged wounds that had been sustained in battle only days earlier. The Americans didn't mock them, didn't parade them through the camps in humiliation. The prisoners were allowed to pray, to rest, to live. For many, the psychological dissonance was unbearable. Some refused food for days, believing it was poison. Others sat in silence, too ashamed to speak. Yet as time passed, the human instinct to survive began to override indoctrinated shame. And then came the moment that changed everything. The order from the American guards. They could write home, a simple act, but for the prisoners, it was unimaginable. In Japanese culture, communication with one's family after dishonor was forbidden. To write home from captivity meant publicly admitting shame. Yet as they were handed paper and pencils, many broke down in tears. Some wrote shakily that they were alive. Others apologized for not dying in battle. Many simply wrote the names of their children over and over, as if to remind themselves that they still existed in the world. The American guards, too, were deeply affected. They had fought fierce battles, seen their friends killed by Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender. To now see those same enemies reduced to frightened, starving men, writing tender letters to their families, created a strange mix of empathy and sorrow. It was the first time many Americans realized that the enemy, indoctrinated, fanatical, and fierce, was still human. These moments, small and almost invisible in the scale of the Pacific War, became symbols of a deeper truth. Compassion, when extended even to one's enemy, had the power to disarm hatred in ways that bullets never could. The cultural gap between the Americans and the Japanese was vast, almost unbridgeable. The U.S. Army followed the Geneva Convention, a document grounded in Western ideals of individual rights, humanitarian treatment, and the rule of law. For them, war was brutal, but even the enemy retained a degree of personhood. A soldier could be captured, disarmed, and imprisoned, but he was still a man, deserving of food, shelter, and decency. In contrast, the Imperial Japanese military operated under an entirely different worldview. To surrender was not a tactical decision. It was an act of spiritual annihilation. Under the Bushido code, loyalty and honor to the emperor outweighed survival. Soldiers were taught that the captured were beyond redemption, stripped of honor, forever shamed, and no longer Japanese. The Japanese state propaganda reinforced this idea, claiming that the Americans executed POWs or used them for sadistic experiments. This myth kept soldiers fighting to the death, even when defeat was certain. When those same soldiers found themselves alive, cared for, and permitted to write home, it was a psychological shock that few could process. Their worldview had no framework for mercy from an enemy. Some thought it was a trick, a deception before execution. Others believed the Americans were mocking them. Only after weeks of consistent kindness did they begin to accept that the rules they had lived by, the doctrines of death before dishonor, might not be universal truths after all. In Japanese culture, the letter carried a profound emotional weight. To be allowed to send one meant being acknowledged as human, not as an outcast. And when those letters were translated and delivered through Red Cross channels, they reached mothers, wives, and children who had already mourned their loved ones. For them, the shock was just as profound. It was the first tangible sign that the imperial government had lied. The Americans hadn't just captured bodies. They had cracked a psychological code. Through a single envelope, they had pierced the veil of propaganda that had sustained the Japanese war machine for years. Behind the compassion shown in the POW camps lay a subtle but deliberate layer of strategy. The U.S. military understood that warfare was not only about firepower, it was also about breaking the enemy's will to fight. Every Japanese soldier who surrendered represented not just a captured enemy, but a psychological victory. The U.S. had studied Japan's psychological warfare doctrine, which relied heavily on indoctrination and fear. Japanese troops were made to believe that capture meant certain death, ensuring they would fight to the last man. By proving those lies false, the Americans aimed to weaken the enemy's confidence in their leaders and ideology. Allowing prisoners to write letters home became a subtle but potent weapon. These letters, censored for security but truthful in essence, served as living proof that the Americans were not the monsters Tokyo described. When some of those letters, despite Japanese censorship, reached civilian hands, they contradicted everything the imperial government had built its morale upon. The impact was quiet but profound. By 1945, American psychological operations, psyops, began dropping leaflets over Japanese positions, quoting real excerpts from POW letters. "I am alive. I am treated fairly. The Americans give us food." For men still fighting in caves or jungles, these words were like forbidden fruit, whispers of a different reality. They planted seeds of doubt. If capture was survivable, perhaps surrender was no longer dishonor. Perhaps death was not the only escape. The U.S. saw this as a way to save lives on both sides. Every surrender meant fewer suicidal charges, fewer civilian deaths, fewer wasted lives. In the closing months of the war, as the Americans advanced closer to the Japanese mainland, the propaganda war built partly upon those POW letters, became as critical as bombs and bullets. Mercy, once considered a weakness, had become a strategic weapon. In Tokyo, the Japanese Home Ministry and Imperial Army's Information Bureau moved swiftly to suppress the growing trickle of POW letters. Officials labeled them enemy lies, claiming they were written under duress or fabricated by American propagandists. Editors were ordered to destroy any mention of surviving prisoners. To admit that Japanese soldiers were living comfortably in American custody would unravel the core of the nation's wartime identity, the belief that the emperor's soldiers never surrendered. Yet the letters existed, and some inevitably reached private households. In villages across Japan, whispers began to spread. He says he is alive. He says the Americans feed him. He says he will come home someday. For ordinary Japanese citizens, weary from years of bombing, starvation, and endless loss, these letters were not betrayal. They were hope. Hope that their sons or husbands were still alive. Hope that mercy still existed in a war that had taken everything from them. Meanwhile, the American media also recognized the symbolic power of these letters. In newspapers and magazines, stories began appearing about the humane treatment of Japanese POW. Stories designed to highlight American moral superiority. They served a dual purpose: to boost Allied morale and to remind the world that the United States fought not only with weapons, but with principle. In stark contrast stood the Japanese treatment of Allied POWs, the Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the starvation of prisoners in Changi and Palawan. The comparison was not lost on anyone. While the Axis powers brutalized their captives, the United States showcased its adherence to law, order, and humanity. To many Americans, it was a matter of conscience. To the U.S. War Department, it was also psychological warfare at its finest, a battle for perception that would ripple far beyond the war's end. Through every letter written, every envelope sealed, a message traveled across the Pacific stronger than any propaganda film. The Americans fight hard, but they do not lose their humanity. And that message, quietly carried by thousands of Japanese hands, began to erode the iron walls of imperial fanaticism, one sentence at a time. The scene unfolds on the scorched fields of Saipan. Mid-1944, the island has just fallen after one of the most savage battles of the Pacific War. Smoke still rises from the cliffs, where thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians had chosen suicide over surrender. Now, amid the wreckage, several hundred survivors sit silently in a fenced compound built from salvaged barbed wire and bamboo pole. The air is thick and humid, filled with the dull hum of flies. The prisoners' uniforms are in tatters. Many are wounded or barefoot. American guards, rifles slung loosely at their sides, move through the rows handing out tin cups of water and small packets of rice. The prisoners avert their eyes, expecting trickery. Every act of kindness confuses them further. Then comes the order that will define this moment. An interpreter, a Nisei sergeant from California, steps forward with a sheaf of papers and a box of pencils. He explains, in careful Japanese, that by order of the U.S. Command and the International Red Cross, each prisoner may write a short letter home. A murmur spreads through the ranks. Some men glance at one another, uncertain if they've heard correctly. Write home? To Japan? To their families? The words sound impossible. The sergeant continues, his voice even and calm. The letters, he says, must be limited to simple facts, health, safety, and location, and will be censored before delivery. No politics, no secrets. But yes, they will reach Japan. For a long time, no one moves. Then, from the back row, an older soldier, his bandaged arm still in a sling, takes a sheet of paper. His hand trembles as he writes. Others slowly follow. The only sounds are the scratch of pencils and the distant surf beyond the camp. Some men write just 3 words, "I am alive." Others fill every line with apologies. Apologies to parents, to wives, to commanders for failing to die. One young man writes of the strange mercy of his captors. They give us food. They treat our wounds. I cannot understand it. Hours later, the stack of envelopes is collected, stamped with Red Cross seals, and sent toward the Pacific Mail Line. For the prisoners, it feels unreal. like casting messages into the sea. For the Americans, it is routine paperwork. But neither side yet understands that those letters will travel far beyond the camp fences. Weeks later, when the first deliveries slip quietly through Japan's censors, a shockwave passes through the home front. Mothers who had received notice of glorious death in battle suddenly hold proof of life. The state newspapers remain silent, but whispers begin in markets and temples. Some of our men are alive. The Americans are not killing them. It is a turning point invisible on maps, but powerful in hearts, a moment when mercy becomes a weapon sharper than steel. As the weeks passed, the ripple effects of those letters began to move through both sides of the Pacific, quietly but powerfully. What began as a simple act of compliance with the Geneva Convention had become something much larger, a psychological breach in the walls of imperial propaganda. Inside Japan, the letters arrived one by one, filtered through layers of censorship. Officials read each line carefully before stamping them approved. Many were confiscated outright, but some slipped through, carried by postal workers who didn't fully understand what they were handling. Fragile pieces of paper that contradicted everything the Japanese people had been told about the enemy. At kitchen tables and shrines, families unfolded the letters with trembling hands. They had been told their sons had died heroically, that no Japanese soldier would ever surrender. Yet the handwriting was unmistakable. A husband's, a son's, a brother's. I am alive. I am treated well. The Americans are not cruel. The shock was profound. For families already mourning, it was a strange resurrection. For the imperial government, it was a nightmare. In Tokyo, the War Ministry held emergency meetings. Censors were ordered to seize any remaining correspondence. Newspapers received directives forbidding any mention of surviving soldiers in captivity. To acknowledge their existence was to undermine the entire foundation of the empire's war narrative. For 2 decades, Japanese militarism had been built on the ideal of honor through death. To die for the emperor was the greatest act of devotion. To live as a prisoner was to abandon one's soul. These letters shattered that ideal, each one proof that life after surrender was possible. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American intelligence officers began to realize the potential of this revelation. Reports from captured Japanese diaries and interrogations showed growing confusion among enemy troops. Leaflets were soon dropped over isolated islands, quoting genuine POW letters and showing photographs of captured soldiers alive and healthy. The effect was subtle but undeniable. On several islands, surrender rates began to increase. For the first time, Japanese soldiers were beginning to question what they'd been taught. On Iwo Jima, Marines would later report finding letters on fallen Japanese soldiers, copies of Red Cross notes written by friends already in captivity. The men who carried them never lived to use them, but they had clung to them as tokens of possibility, proof that mercy might still exist in war. This moment marked a quiet turning point, not in strategy, but in the psychology of battle. The war in the Pacific was still merciless, still fought with unimaginable brutality. Yet, for the first time, the absolute divide between life and death, surrender and honor, began to blur. For the Americans, this outcome confirmed what their commanders had hoped all along, that humanity could be more powerful than intimidation. The letters were not propaganda in the traditional sense. They were acts of truth, undeniable, human, and deeply subversive to the militarist lies that had bound an entire nation. By 1945, with Japan's defeat looming, these fragments of correspondence became small symbols of what would eventually define the post-war reconciliation between the two nations. What had started as an act of mercy had quietly begun to reshape the way two enemies would one day see each other, not as monsters, but as men. The letters from Saipan had done more than reach Japan. They had reached the human conscience. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the world stood in stunned silence. Japan had surrendered. Cities once burning under bombs now lay in ruin, and soldiers who had survived the war, on both sides, faced a different kind of reckoning. Among the thousands of men in American-run POW camps, word spread that the war was over. The guards were no longer enemies. The guns were lowered. The men who had expected to die in captivity now had to face something even harder, returning home alive. For the Japanese prisoners, the moment was deeply conflicted. They felt relief, even joy, but it was mixed with an almost unbearable shame. The same soldiers who had once been given paper to write home would now be repatriated to a nation that considered them dishonored. They had survived, but survival itself was a mark of disgrace. When the first groups of Japanese POWs were returned from camps in Hawaii, California, and the Philippines, their arrival was quiet and uncelebrated. There were no banners, no families waiting with open arms. Many were interrogated by Japanese officials, questioned about their conduct in captivity, and viewed with suspicion. Some were even ostracized by neighbors who whispered that they had collaborated with the Americans. The letters they had written, once symbols of hope, were now reminders of humiliation. Yet, in the United States, the story of those letters took on a very different meaning. American military archives preserved thousands of them, carefully translated, catalogued, and studied. To American officers and historians, these messages represented a moral victory in a war otherwise defined by extremes of destruction. The act of letting an enemy write home had proven that the U.S. military could fight fiercely without abandoning its principles. It became a case study in how ethical conduct and psychological strategy could coexist on the battlefield. Reports, compiled by the U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division, noted that the humane treatment of POWs had contributed to measurable increases in surrender rates during the final year of the war. In places like Okinawa and the Philippines, interrogations revealed that word of captured men being treated kindly and even writing letters home had begun circulating among the troops. The policy had saved countless lives, both American and Japanese. At the same time, within the camps themselves, small acts of reconciliation began to emerge. Japanese prisoners offered to help maintain the grounds, build chapels, and even assist American doctors. Some learned English, others drew sketches of their captors or crafted wooden trinkets to give as parting gifts. A few American guards admitted, years later, that they had felt more respect for these captured enemies than for some of their own officers. Humanity, it seemed, could survive even in the most inhuman of circumstances. As peace returned to the Pacific, the letters that had once bridged two warring nations now became artifacts, silent witnesses to a moment when compassion defied hatred. In the years that followed Japan's surrender, the legacy of those letters and the prisoners who wrote them continued to echo quietly through both nations. The U.S. Army archives would preserve them as examples of humane warfare, while in Japan, their memory lived on in fragments, whispered among families, hidden in drawers, and remembered by those who had once been told that no soldier ever returned alive. When the war crimes trials began in Tokyo, 1946-1948, the contrast between the treatment of Allied prisoners by Japan and the treatment of Japanese POWs by America became one of the starkest moral dividing lines in the Pacific War. The Allied prosecutors presented evidence of atrocities from Bataan, Burma, and Changi, acts of starvation, torture, and massacre. And then, in counterpoint, they cited the American policy of compliance with the Geneva Convention, even against enemies who had refused to recognize it. This comparison was not just about justice, it was about identity. The United States emerged from the war determined to show that its strength came not from cruelty, but from discipline and principle. For Japan, the lesson was harder. The empire's collapse forced an entire nation to confront the lies it had been built upon. The myth of the noble death had ended not with victory, but with ruin. And somewhere among the ashes of that myth were the letters, written by men who had been condemned for surviving, yet whose words now carried the proof that compassion had existed even amid destruction. By the 1950s, a few of those former prisoners began to speak about their experiences publicly. Some wrote memoirs describing their astonishment at being treated humanely, at receiving food, medical care, and even the chance to write home. One recalled how, when he handed his letter to the American sergeant, he expected it to be burned in front of him. Instead, the guard smiled and said, "It will get there." That small exchange had changed his life. Many of these men would go on to live quietly, avoiding attention. But their memories and the survival of their letters became valuable records for historians seeking to understand the moral psychology of the Pacific War. These accounts helped humanize both sides, revealing that beneath layers of propaganda, ordinary soldiers had the same fears, loves, and hopes. The Red Cross, too, took note. The success of the American mail system for enemy prisoners became a model for post-war humanitarian standards. When the Geneva Conventions were expanded in 1949, the right of prisoners of war to correspond with family was reaffirmed and strengthened, largely inspired by the positive precedents set during World War II. In Japan, decades later, historians began to reassess the role of POWs in their national memory. The letters once seen as marks of shame were reinterpreted as symbols of survival, proof that even in defeat, there was dignity in living. Museums in Tokyo and Kyoto would later display copies of some of these letters, alongside exhibits detailing the lives of soldiers who returned home not as heroes of conquest, but as witnesses of humanity. Those simple sheets of paper, once written under the watchful eyes of guards in Saipan and Guam, had outlived empires. They had become testaments, not to power or victory, but to the endurance of compassion when the world had forgotten what mercy meant. War has always been measured in victories and defeats, in the number of ships sunk, cities destroyed, and soldiers lost. But in the quiet corners of history, there are moments that defy those measures. The letters written by Japanese prisoners of war were among them. They were not weapons, nor strategy, nor grand declarations. They were simple human gestures, and yet they carried more weight than 1,000 guns. In a war defined by hatred, the decision to let an enemy write home was a radical act of moral courage. It was proof that even amid the brutality of the Pacific, humanity could still survive. For the Americans, it affirmed that discipline and compassion were not contradictions, but strengths. For the Japanese prisoners, it shattered years of indoctrination, the belief that mercy was weakness, that surrender was shame, that death was the only path to honor. Those pieces of paper, folded and sent across oceans, became silent ambassadors between two nations at war. They carried no propaganda, no politics, only life. And that life, declared in the simplest words, "I am alive," became a quiet rebellion against the machinery of total war. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt from ruin and America emerged as a global power, these small acts of compassion became part of a larger story. The story of how empires fell, but empathy endured. The same nations that had once fought to the death would go on to rebuild together, to trade, to teach, to remember. The letters from Saipan, Guam, and beyond remain in archives today, yellowed, fragile, and almost forgotten. Yet they remind us of something eternal, that in every conflict, beneath every uniform, the human heart still beats the same. It is easy to destroy. It takes strength to show mercy, and sometimes mercy is what changes history. The Japanese prisoners never imagined that their letters would survive, or that they would one day be read not as signs of weakness, but as symbols of humanity's resilience. In the silence of the camps, surrounded by war, they wrote, not to win, but simply to be remembered. And in doing so, they proved that even in war's darkest hours, compassion can still speak louder than fear.